Thank you for the introduction, and for those expecting slides, you're not going to get them, all right? This is wonderful, I can draw with it. My job today is to talk about complexity, culture, confusion. I really want to start off with some basic principles. A lot of people think that culture can be engineered. You'll find this, a huge amount of consultants, particularly in Agile, will offer you these type of services. They try and define what a culture should be. You get mission statements, you get value statements, you get collections of platitudes put together to say this is how we would like to be. Yeah? Now, if you know anything at all about anthropology, you know that when a culture writes its values down, it's just lost them. Because all you've done is tell people how they should describe what they do. You haven't changed reality. Yeah? So writing culture down is not what it's about. So 3 basic principles of culture. Culture is first and fundamentally what we do. How you actually act, how you interact with people is much more impressive than how you say you will do so. You know, to say we're going to be a customer-focused company is completely irrelevant if your rules and processes prevent customer-focused staff from responding to customer need outside a rigid process. What we do matters far more than what we say in terms of culture. The second thing is what we did. What we did in the past determines how people see us in the present. I do a fair amount of work on peace and reconciliation, which is becoming more and more important. And if you've got massive conflict situations, say post-terrorist reconciliation, the way people describe their past determines what's possible in the present. Until you change the way that people think about the past, a new future isn't possible. The past determines the way we are. Some of the work we do on this, for example, what we've done worldwide, is to get children at the age of 16 or 17 to go into their communities and find people in their grandparents' and their parents' generation they most respect, and ask that person to tell them the story that that individual thinks the child should remember for all time. Yeah, in anthropology, these are called sacred stories. It's the stories of your own life that you want your children or your grandchildren to remember. So to give you an illustration, I'm Welsh. Now you know that to call me English is a deadly insult, right? My children will remember that you did it, their children will remember you did it. It will go on for several generations, right? Now, one of my stories that I remember most from my grandmother is around about the turn of the last century, which shows how old I was. The English decided that the Welsh should receive education. That was nice of them, with generous gift. We were prepared to take it. But the education had to be in English, not in Welsh. Yeah? So if my grandmother was caught speaking Welsh in school, she had a wooden badge hung around her neck. It was called the Welsh knot. She then had to catch one of her friends speaking Welsh, at which point she could hand over the knot, and whoever wore the knot at the end of the day would be thrashed by the teacher. Yeah? Now everybody in Wales knows that story, nobody in England knows that story. But it's a fundamental definition story in terms of our own identity as a nation and our regard and our attitude to our next door neighbour. Now that's a major, well, from the Welsh point of view, it's major. We're only 3 million people, but we produce most of Europe's best opera singers, so we claim that one, right? But fundamentally, you can do the same thing in organizations. We're working with Gaping Void at the moment. You may know their cartoons. And what we're doing is getting new joiners in the company to go and find people in previous generations. You've got the grandfather parent edition, and ask for the stories of the company's foundation, the stories of when you joined the company. Effectively, they're acting as a journalist to the older generations. And that increases the integration, but it allows us to capture the narratives which define how the organization regards itself. Many of you are in startup companies. You need to capture your founder stories now. because the founder stories will determine the culture of the company for decades to come. Yeah, and that's the aspect of it. So mapping stories is key because they describe what we did, but it's also critically the stories that people tell. So it doesn't matter what you think you are, it doesn't matter what you think you do. What really matters is the stories that people tell about you. And they come from past experiences. So most of you are in IT. So you go to the user community and you say, guys, this is wonderful. We've just become agile. Yeah, from now on, everything will be wonderful. Life in the universe will be harmonious. Yeah? Software will be delivered quickly. Yeah, we just need you to sort of accept the fact there are sprints, there'll be failure, we need user executives, but don't worry, everything is going to be wonderful. How many times have you done that to them before? What's the history of IT projects in your company? How many times have you come in with a new magical method which will now solve the problems of the past? People remember things based on trigger mechanisms on past memories. Okay? Now let's get really scary. If you actually show a group of radiologists, these are, radiologists, it's a medical discipline, a batch of x-rays, yeah, and that's a limited information set, all right? On one of the x-rays, you hide a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of an average cancer nodule, and you ask radiologists to detect anomalies on the x-rays. 83% don't see the picture of the gorilla, even though their eyes scan it. Yeah? We do not see what we do not expect to see. And that's actually really important because you can't overcome that. It's a feature of how human beings work. And what actually happens is you look at about 5% of the available data. Major implications for this, by the way, on software testing, which we're working on. You look at about 5% of the data on a good day, if you're really focused, and you do a first fit pattern match with your previous experience. So the radiologist has somewhere in the region of 15 to 20,000 patterns stored in their brain, their body, their tools, associated with their past experience and training. The most frequently used patterns are nearer the surface, so they get activated first. So a radiologist looks at 5% of the X-ray, and they do a first fit pattern match, not a best fit pattern match. And that's how we all make decisions. Yeah? Now, critical on that, and if you think about it, in evolutionary terms, it makes a lot of sense. You think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa. Something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Yeah? Do you want to autistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, go on an accreditation course over 2 days to gain yourself a certificate in anti-lion avoidance behavior? I mean, that would be the Agile way. Agile is focused these days on accreditation, not software delivery. Right? You don't do that. You actually very quickly sense danger and you run like hell. Yeah, the old joke is if you meet a lion in the jungle, what matters is who runs faster, because the person who runs slowest gets caught by the lion. Yeah? So we evolved to make decisions very, very quickly based on a partial data scan, privilege in our most recent experiences. Yeah? So it follows logically from that the way you are seen by other departments in the company is by the stories they remember of your past interaction with them. And now it gets worse. Human beings remember failure, they don't remember success. Yeah, again, there are evolutionary reasons for this. For those of you with children, do you tell your children stories about how Janet and John stayed at home and did what Mummy and Daddy said so the world was a better place? Or do you tell them stories about how Janet and John went into the woods on their own against Mummy's and Daddy's advice? They met wolves, witches, and almost died, but we always rescue them at the end because we want them to sleep at night. Yeah? All human story traditions evolved to tell stories of failure, not stories of success. And the reason is, in evolutionary terms, avoidance of failure is a more successful strategy than imitation of success. It's why we actually build worst practice-based systems for companies, not best practice systems. Worst practice systems contain far more learning than best practice systems, and they open up novel possibilities. Yeah, the way we evolved as a species is to let each generation know about our failures, but leave open to them new pathways. If you try and define exactly where you want to go, you discourage the discovery of novelty. Yeah, we need to start journeys, but not set goals, and that's a really important principle in modern software development. But basically, based on a very partial memory, in which people will privilege things which go wrong, those are the stories people tell about you. And no amount of saying it's wrong, and no amount of promising a wonderful future will make the blindest bit of difference. Yeah, that's the fundamental filter mechanism. The most effective way, because actually this is the most important, this is the second most important, and this is the third. The critical thing if you want to make a change is to change this to impact on that. If what you actually do makes negative stories unsustainable, then those stories change. One of the things we say when we work with leaders on 360 feedback is we give them the stories told by people around them. And we say, basically, if this is a negative story, you don't tell people it's wrong. You go and do something which makes it impossible for somebody to tell that story anymore. Yeah, a famous phrase in English, actions speak louder than words. Yeah? Doing small things to disrupt negative stories is far more effective than doing a 2-day off-site workshop, defining the mission and value statements, and running a propaganda campaign all over the company to say, now we're like this. Yeah? Small changes in the present have much more impact than ambitious statements about the future. Yeah? So hold that, because I want to come back and build on that. Fundamentally, we've got to change the narratives around us and the narratives we tell ourselves if we actually want to create a different type of culture. Now, the other thing, and you see this awful word in Agile a lot, all right, it's called mindset. Anybody come across the mindset word? Yeah, it's not about the methods, it's about the mindset, it's all this sort of thing. Now, this is kind of like okay and kind of like bad. At one point, you get this attitude, it doesn't matter what method we use or what tools we use, provided we have the right mindset. Yeah? Now, that, again, is really bad anthropology. Yeah? We're homo faber, we're tool makers. The tools you use, the processes you link in, define what you are. It's actually not a matter of mindset overcoming tools. Yeah, there are many tools which are compatible with Agile, and then there are approaches which, to be quite frank and brutal, are not. The adoption of techniques like SAFe, from the point of view of most of our opinions, is the end of Agile. It's the constriction of a dynamic method into a rigid form, only sustainable by largely ignoring the practice and getting people to pretend they're doing Agile while not doing it. Yeah? The danger is you move into a rigid process, your culture is process, the stories about you are process-based. No amount of mindset will overcome a tool which doesn't permit it. Yeah, it's like Six Sigma. Anybody come across Six Sigma yet? Business process re-engineering taken to excess. Abandoned by 3M because it was destroying their capacity to innovate. Because if you over-constrain a system, people can't express creativity, and cultures associated with innovation are not possible. So the idea that mindset exists independently of tools is critical, is a bad one and very dangerous. Tools we use define what we are. Yeah? Now, part of this is the whole question about context and where you do things. So at that point, I'll introduce the Cynefin framework, because I've been told I've got to explain it. Cynefin is a Welsh word. It's pronounced Cynefin. Welsh is phonetic, so it's easy to pronounce, provided you realize we have a different alphabet, right? But you should be familiar with that one, right? It means, its literal translation into English is habitat or place. but nobody in Wales would use it for anything that trivial. Interestingly, the English don't have an equivalent word which says something about them. In Wales, it means the place of your multiple belongings. It's a sense that you live in a flow of time in which your past partly determines your present and your future. You can never fully understand it, but you're part of that flow. It's a flow concept. It's not a static concept. The reason the English don't have an equivalent is they've never had a place of their own. They've only ever stolen other people's. We haven't forgiven them for the 13th century, and we don't plan to anytime soon. We have long memories as Celts, right? So it's a good name for a complexity framework. Now, it's drawn like this, and I'll describe it briefly. It's not drawn like this and add that later when you think I might spot you doing it on the internet, all right? That's how it's drawn. And it's got 5 domains based on different types of system and different relationships between cause and effect. So what I'm going to do is to run through that briefly, then use it to describe different agile methods. So some things get excluded, some things get added in. Here we have the domain of where the relationship between cause and effect is obvious. Everybody can see what it is, everybody buys into it. So as you know, in civilized countries, we drive on the left-hand side of the road. So if you come to Britain and you drive on the right-hand side of the road, expect consequences. Now, it's neither right nor wrong, kind of like we, for reasons nobody really understands, decided to drive on the left, other people decided to drive on the right. In Italy, south of Naples, it doesn't matter what side of the road you drive on, provided you drive with confidence. I've learned that over the years. But fundamentally, it's an accepted practice. We do it. It's not without exclusion. If a child runs onto the road in front of you, you drive wherever you can to avoid hitting them. But basically, everybody buys in, everybody knows what to do. So this is the domain of best practice. There is one right way of doing things, and the way we make decisions is we sense, we categorize, respond. It's one of these, it fits this category, this is what we do. And what I've got here are fixed constraints. There is one right way of doing things. Now that's really useful, provided you don't take it to excess. If you carry it to excess, people start to break the rules in order to do a good job. One of the scary things in safety at the moment is in order to get the job done, most employees have to break the rules. Because the rules are over-constraining, and actually the reality catches up on that. Now, say I learned this the hard way. I worked for IBM for 7 years. If you work for IBM, you get to understand bureaucracy in a way that you never get even in government departments, right? And we were a small Anglo-Dutch software development house, and they took us over. It was 48 hours from approach to acquisition. It was very scary. And then everything changed. We had 3 levels of management, kind of like we'd grown up together. We knew what to do. Now we're part of this huge international machine. And the first thing they did was to charge us for coffee and ban alcohol. Now, this is completely unreasonable, right? The coffee-alcohol cycle is critical to good software development, right? Nobody should be expected to talk to users without alcohol first, all right? I mean, users are difficult. You then have to have coffee to sober up to write the code. Then you need even more alcohol because users never want what you can prove they asked for when you give it them. They always want something else instead. And I'll come back to that one later, because the way we extract user need basically just builds on past patterns. It doesn't introduce novelty. But the reality is that was the way it worked, and we were not happy. So we got around that. We simply held design meetings in off-site hotels that would charge us for meeting rooms and wouldn't mention the coffee and the alcohol. There was always a way around that, right? And then it got even worse. They banned us from buying food for staff. Now, by this time, I'm a C-level executive, right? That means you only get to see angry customers. The more you get promoted, the less good experience you have of customers, all right? It just gets worse and worse as you go further up the ladder, all right? Until you get high enough, other people can filter it for you. But there's this awful period there. And I said, well, and we'd learned by now you didn't argue with IBM bureaucrats based on an evidence. The only technique which worked, which we were taught in philosophy, was a Socratic technique. That means you ask people questions until they contradict themselves and they're forced to change. This, by the way, is a very dangerous strategy. If you know the history of what happened to Socrates, sooner or later people gather and vote to have you executed, all right, because they get fed up of being shown how contradictory they are. But it can be fun in the short term, right? So I said, okay, so, the other day I was called out 3 o'clock in the morning. I got in at 4 o'clock. We've got an emergency service, a 999 service in the UK. On VAX clusters, we got a massive failure on the VAX cluster. We got very few skills left in VAX, right? If it's not up by 9 o'clock in the morning, there are massive penalty clauses and the 999 service won't work. I said, the only thing I can do as a senior executive, because I know I'm going to get all the flack at 9 a.m., right? I've just got to get this team motivated and awake enough to fix the problem. So I bought them pizza and Coke, which is the most effective way, right? And they looked at me in a slightly disturbed way, and I realized they might have misunderstood this. I said, I did mean the drink, just to be clear about this, all right? I don't want any misunderstandings, and they were a bit relieved at that point. And they said, okay, we understand this may be necessary, So you can actually buy food for staff, we'll vary the process, provided you get vice presidential approval 48 hours in advance. Now, at this point, you breathe very deeply, And you say, okay, that's a good idea. We wouldn't have thought of that. And then you realize irony is a deadly weapon you can use against bureaucrats because you don't get it. What happens on the extremely rare occasion where we don't get 48 hours notice of a major crisis? You resist the temptation to say, if I had 48 hours notice, I wouldn't have a crisis in the first place. That's logic, all right? You're not using logic. And they looked a bit puzzled at that, and then they said yes in a way which means no. They said, okay, country general manager approval after the event. Now, if you work for IBM, you know that that means your expenses will disappear into the South Bank offices. They'll never be signed. And if you complain about it, your name will appear on the wrong sorts of lists. You do not want to be on those lists at quarter end, all right? They're dangerous lists. So I gather, and of course I would never do this, and nobody I knew would ever do this, all right? But I heard about this on the rumour mill. Some managers started to over-tip London taxi drivers. Because if you over-tip a taxi driver, they give you a blank receipt. The blank receipt was then filled out for the amount of pizza and Coke bought for the staff. A parallel set of books was kept, signed off by the staff, and the responsible or irresponsible manager, depending on your perspective, then took a bus but claimed a taxi. Either way, that was over 20 years ago. I was at a conference in Dubai and I gave this example. A guy from IBM ran up to me afterwards, opened his wallet, full of blank receipts, and said, we're still doing that, did you invent it? If you over-constrain a system, you remove all flexibility. People will find workarounds and you lose control. And again, if you over-constrain your users, they'll start to use open source tools, they'll start to do all sorts of things to work around you because you've created excessive constraint. Which is why this domain here is actually shown as a cliff. What happens is if you get it wrong, you fall over the edge into chaos. And chaos is a state where you've got no constraints anymore. And the trouble is, you may think at a surface level everything is working well, but underneath you've got total chaos. So that's dangerous, right? We actually talk about this zone here as the zone of complacency. You've actually got nice structure, everything is working fine. You think everything is good. The reality is you're on the edge of a catastrophic failure. So chaos entered accidentally is a bad idea, but of course it won't stand for long. We then get a complicated relationship between cause and effect. So at this point, my method not everybody can't see what the right thing is to do. So at this point, I sense, analyze, respond. And I work within what are called governing constraints. Now that's an important distinction. Governing constraints means that within this boundary, I've got freedom of action, provided I've got the right education and the right experience. Yeah? Which means I'm not applying best practice, I'm applying good practice. Now, a lot of consultancy-led initiatives get this wrong. They try and impose one way of working where actually some variety is possible, provided you've got the right background, over-constrained. But the point is, in both of these domains, the two ordered domains on Cynefin, there is a right way to do things. It's either self-evident or it can be discovered at comparatively low cost. Then we get into the interesting stuff, the complex domain. Now, the critical thing to understand about complexity is this is a domain where there are many, many modulating factors. So the metaphor I want to use for this is, imagine, if you want, that you've got a series of magnets around a flat surface, and in the middle of the flat surface there are cast iron discs. Yeah? So if all of the magnets keep the same polarity and the same strength, the cast iron discs will form a stable pattern. If I change one of the magnets, I can predict what will happen to the discs. In systems thinking, which has dominated the last 3 decades, that's called a driver. And people ask, what are the drivers of employee behavior? What are the drivers of consumer behavior? And that's okay. I change one driver, I can see what happens. I change 2 magnets. It's getting a bit more difficult, but I can still model it, I can still predict it. 3 magnets, it's over. And the reality is all of the magnets are continuously changing. And some of the iron discs become magnets themselves as they pass through low electrical fields. Yeah? That's a complex adaptive system. And we call the magnets modulators, not drivers. There are so many things which can influence behavior and response that you can never fully model them or predict them. But you can manage them with a real-time feedback loop. So if you can actually change enough of the magnets in real time, you can see what's happening in front of you, you can manage what happens. One of the key things on complexity, the most vital thing, and this applies to many ways, and I'll give you some examples of this in a minute, is we need real-time feedback. Even a sprint is too long a time for really complex problems. That doesn't mean it doesn't have value, but it's too long a time. We need to be in much shorter life cycles with much tighter feedback loops, because what's possible is determined by what we do, not by the system itself. In a complex world, there isn't a right answer, but there are right directions of travel. And that has major implications for software development. This is where the real advantage comes if you can get it right. Key thing to understand in a complex system is that a complex system is dispositional. It's not causal. There isn't a linear relationship between cause and effect. The best that you can say is the system is disposed in this way. These things are more probable than these things, but you can never say what will happen. Now, that has a profound effect on organizational design, but also on software design. Because the software tools you introduce will change the way that people think. This, for example, as a tool, once you get one of these with an iPad Pro, you start to do things you didn't do before that you didn't know you needed to do. One of the huge things that technology has done over the past 2 decades is to open up possibilities that people could not have defined in advance. Effectively, technology these days starts to match unarticulated needs, not articulated needs. But software development methods assume articulated needs. And that's deeply problematic. And the more structured the method, the more it requires clear articulation. So here, practice is emergent, And critically here, we do parallel probes. We probe sense respond. We do multiple small experiments to see what's possible. And we don't close down options until the last possible minute. Yeah? In chaos, we get novel practice, but in complexity, practice is emergent. Now, if we look at the implications for this for software development, I'll draw the model again like this. And what I want to introduce now is another key concept, which is a concept of liminality. And for that, I draw another domain, which looks like this. Now, liminality is a key concept in anthropology. So when somebody dons a mask, look at indigenous groups, when I put a mask on, I become something different. But there's a state of transition where I'm not what I was before, and I'm not going to be what I've become. It's rather like a chrysalis, if you want, between a caterpillar and a butterfly. It's a liminal state, it's a state of transition. Now, liminality is a key concept here. So if you look at what we currently do, Scrum as a method sits here. Scrum is in the liminal area between complex and complicated. Yeah? It takes one idea, it works with users define that idea, then it goes through a 2-week iteration cycle to get it right. Yeah? Very valuable, hugely valuable. It's one of the best techniques ever developed to shift things from complex to complicated, but it's a single line. Yeah, so it's not purely complex, it's a complex to complicated transition technique. The trouble is, people tried to make a technique appropriate in one space universal. And this is a huge problem. People keep trying to make things universal, they don't understand reality. Over here, there's nothing wrong with a time box. Anybody old enough to remember time boxes? You say, we'll deliver on this date, we'll vary the resource or we'll vary the delivery, but we'll guarantee a date. And a time box could be 3 months or 6 months. It doesn't have to be 2 weeks. It can have a different type of resource. Yeah? Nothing wrong with that. You don't have to make everything 2-week sprints. I was working with Telstra in Australia. They actually run waterfall projects. I mean, you're in IT. I mean, many of you are in the banking sector. There are some things you do which are waterfall. You know exactly what you've got to achieve. You know within constraints the resource you need. It's going to take you a year to do it. It's a waterfall project. Nothing wrong with that. Yeah? And in Telstra, because nobody got promoted unless they were agile, they started to do 1-year sprints so they could say they were agile. And again, it's this example of going down a single-track road and not reason it. Oh, and by the way, there's absolutely nothing wrong with waterfall. And you don't need to use something like safe and release trains from that, because there are better, more disciplined methods with more research behind them. Yeah? It's not that one thing is right or wrong, but things are wrong or right within boundaries. Yeah? So things which actually start in Scrum can actually go through this type of cycle. Nothing wrong with it. Yeah, you may not always get there, you may stay at this space. In fact, a lot of software development stays here. What we haven't got is enough techniques over here. So let me give you an example of a couple, then I'm going to come back to the culture word before I finish. So one technique I originally developed in the SDM days is called AAA. This is where the users haven't got a fully articulated need, they're not sure what they want. You as a user community are pretty sure technology could do things they don't know what to ask for. That's really common these days. You know you've got technology could do things, but the users don't know to ask for it. So this was a 24-hour cycle technique we created. I'll offer it to you freely. This is open source. Yeah, we would do a JAD. Any remember JAD, Joint Application Design? Yeah, go back and read up on that stuff. JAD was more agile than most agile methods. All right. What you do is you get some highly specialized prototypers, and interestingly, good prototypers are generally poor delivery coders. They're good at throwing things together quickly, they're poor at delivery. It's a different skill. So you get prototypers, fast prototypers, together with users in a workshop for 8 hours, and you develop a prototype of what they would like. Now that's good, that's conventional Jad. So we did that in London. Then we handed it on to a team in Mumbai, but we didn't tell them what the users had originally asked for. All I saw was the prototype, and they were told to improve it, and they had 8 hours to make it a better prototype. At the end of that 8 hours, they would hand it on to a team in California who would have another 8 hours to improve it. Then they'd hand it back to the original team who would get together in the morning. Every time we got together, the prototype had radically changed. Every time we'd done it, the user said, "Oh my God, I wouldn't have thought of that. That's wonderful. Can I please have it?" Yeah? What you're doing is, under conditions of uncertainty, this is a biological model, you increase mutation so that novelty emerges. Yeah? So I increase the interaction between prototypers and users. I don't force into a story point, which is one person's view of what people need, and it's a fixed point, it's static. You know, story points are static, they're not dynamic. And God help us if you go for an epic, all right? Epics have real problems, all right? They're over-constrained. Yeah? So basically, I allow dynamic interaction between users and technologists for a limited period of time. Sometimes we actually did this with 2,000 or 3,000 people in a virtual community, throwing in ideas as we went. Because you want to maximize variety in the system in a short time scale, we allow mutation, it comes out. That's one example. Yeah? Another thing we're about to develop is a variation of pair programming. So you've got a pair programming team. And I think one of the problems with Agile is XP is one of its origins. But Agile became coterminous with Scrum for a long period. And that was bad for Agile, bad for Scrum. Yeah, a lot of the XP techniques really need to come back into flavor. So if we take pair programming, we're introducing a third element to that, which is a user trained to interpret things to IT people. I've discovered it's a lot easier to train a user to talk to IT people than it is to train IT people to understand users, right? They sort of have different cognitive neuroscience biases, shall we say, all right, as a nice way of putting it. Now, what that allows me to do is deploy a triplet for 1 or 2 days without having to go into a Scrum. That's kind of like an extended form of TICs. And those people are trained in the roles. This is a crew, role and role expectation is crew. And the final one is actually where you gather user stories or user micro-narratives, and you draw them on what's called a fitness landscape. And when the stories start to cluster, that indicates a proto-requirement, and you throw a prototyping team onto that requirement to build a prototype. That's actually mapping unarticulated needs rather than dealing with articulated needs. Now, I've thrown some ideas out here, but the basic principle is that the more you do here, the less risk you have over here. Yeah, the minute you move into something like Scrum, you're making a significant resource commitment. As you move into more structured methods, you're making an even bigger commitment. The more you can do experimentally, the more you can form the space. Okay? Now, I'm trying to give the wider picture on this, because part of the way you train the IT people are seen is by doing precisely that. Now, the other thing is to see things from different perspectives. Yeah. So I'll give you an example from peace and conflict and then say how we apply it within software development. Right? What we do is we take an infographic. This is something we're also about to do, in fact we've just done for cybersecurity. Yeah? What you're trying to do with culture, with cybersecurity, with safety, is you want to measure attitudes, not compliance. Yeah? Attitudes are lead indicators, compliance is a lag indicator. Yeah? So what we're doing here is we present an infographic about a possible future world. We don't say this is the world we want. It's an infographic. It says, you know, we might have these good things, these bad things. It's put together by experts. It can be read off 2 or 3 screens. It's fun. We use cartoonists, whatever. On this one, we then got people in the military. This is a post-conflict resolution. So about 8,000 or 9,000 people in the military to interpret that infographic. And this is done using a concept called high abstraction metadata, which I haven't got time to go into now, but is human metadata, not machine metadata. This is beyond data analytics. Yeah? You're adding a human interpretive layer to the narrative rather than relying on text-based interpretation, which, by the way, means you can use photographs and things like that, which are often better ways of doing meaning. So we basically get them to do it. We get people who used to be terrorists to also interpret it, and we get people who are never in either group to interpret it. And then we look at the map. So I'll draw what the map looked like. It's a dispositional map, and what you ended up with is a pattern like this, another pattern like that, and a final pattern like this. Now this is people in the same population looking at exactly the same data. What you can immediately see from that is that the green and the purple groups, there's no point in them talking with each other because they see the world in a completely different way. Yeah? The red guys in the middle kind of like overlap both, but the one thing green and purple are agreed on is the red guys are idiots. All right, they're neither fish nor fowl, nor one thing or the other. The strategy here, by the way, was to split these guys off so that that becomes more extreme, so we could create something new in the middle. Yeah, and once we've got that on a feedback mechanism, then we go and talk with people. Okay, go to your whole user population and present infographics about the strategic role of IT. Look how different groups of users, how IT people see the same data. You need to understand where people are coming from before you decide where they should go. So very rapidly mapping attitudes is a key issue. We do the same thing on cybersecurity. We present a major breach like the Yahoo breach. We get people to interpret that in ways where they don't know what the right answer is. They then tell a story about why it couldn't happen here and create a scenario about what could happen in the future. I can do all of that in half an hour across the whole workforce. So there's no collusion, no collaboration, and from that I can draw attitudinal maps. That's the same sort of thing we're now doing on user requirements capture. Now that leads into 3 different methods by which you can change culture, and with that I'll finish off. So first is what I'll call a nudge method. So if I take an example here, and again this is me redrawing things from projects, if this, for example, is about speed of delivery, and this is quality of delivery, yeah? So I want high speed delivery, I want high quality of delivery, and we can measure that indirectly. If the dominant view of you as an organization is kind of like a mixture of here and here, that's actually quite a common pattern, yeah? That actually means you've got a problem, because the bulk of the people think you're going to achieve neither. Yeah? And a whole group of people basically think that quality is entirely dependent on lack of speed. So I've got to change my attitude. Now actually the maps are often more like this. Yeah, you'll find clusters. This here is called an adjacent possible. It's a cluster of observational narrative close to where you are, so it's an achievable step, but it's going in the right direction. So this is your IT map, this is how the users perceive you. You don't go out and say, look guys, if you just let us invest in Agile, you'll be over here tomorrow. Won't that be wonderful? Yeah? Oh, and by the way, we'll bring in a happiness consultant so you're really happy as well. It's a 2-day training course, right? That's unrealistic. What you do is you say, okay, what can we do tomorrow to create more like this and fewer like those? And that's a whole new theory of change. What can we do tomorrow to create more like these and fewer like those? And then you measure whether you're doing it. And only when people's perception of IT is kind of like here, do you announce the Agile program. Until people believe that something is possible, you shouldn't say that you're going to do it. And by the way, this is also one of the ways you measure the impact of IT on the wider organization. Yeah? Because I'm timing 45 minutes exactly, so we're all right on that, right? Secondly, that's kind of like where I want to do gradual change. The other is what we call symbiosis. Now, this is actually one of the major methods. The way I got Rad and Jad into data sciences was to attach it to legacy system management. Everybody wanted to buy legacy system management. Nobody wanted to buy rapid application development or object orientation. So I made it a small aspect of our legacy system management offer. I made it small and exciting, but added on to something conventional. So it was no risk. And that's called a symbiotic approach to change. Yeah? And the final one, and this is probably most critical, is where you need radical change. And that, to be honest, is unarticulated needs. If you can actually go to the chief executive officer and say, look what we've got, it does something you didn't know was possible, but actually it changes the business, your whole culture changes. It's the radical act which makes all the old beliefs impossible. But you've got an evidence base for it in terms of the way it works. It's also one of the ways that we encourage leaders to do it. If you've got a bad story about yourself, go and do something so radical that nobody can ever tell it before. So the key message I'm trying to get across is please stop talking about how wonderful the future will be. Please stop talking about agile values. Please stop telling strategy people that they should be agile like you. They've been agile for years. They've been waiting for you to catch up. Trying to confound to sprints ain't going to work. Start to understand where you are, both in terms of your own culture, your own perception of yourself, the perception of your users. That's easy to do. In fact, gathering user stories about what they need can also gather user stories about how IT is perceived. It's the same process. Use that to map the present and identify, do I need to do radical change? Do I need to do incremental change? Or is the only way I'm going to achieve change a symbiotic process? Critically, start from where you are and move in a direction of travel, because then you will discover novelty and you will have a resilient system. If you start by saying where you want to be, which has been the pattern for the last 3 decades, you doom yourself to disappointment, because you will never ever achieve an aspirational goal, but you can undertake an aspirational journey. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you. It's a pleasure.